Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Distinguished scholars, Professor Zain Qasim, colleagues and students, ladies and gentlemen, and all of you from around the globe who have joined us online. Good morning. On behalf of the Institute of Ismaili Studies, London, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to the Ismaili Studies Conference, State of the Field. This is the first conference of this magnitude and latitude that the Institute of Ismaili Studies has undertaken. The conference will focus on the latest developments in the fields of Ismaili studies and also showcase the work undertaken by the IIS since its establishment in 1977. At the inauguration of the IIS, its founder, His Highness the Aga Khan, stated his wish that from its modest beginnings, this institute would grow into an internationally recognized academic center. As the IIS moves closer to marking its first half century, I think it would not be arrogant to claim that we have realized much of this aspiration with an awareness that this is a work in progress. There are still so many unexplored areas of Ismaili studies and hence the ongoing publishing and research record of the IIS. Over the course of many years, the different departments of the IIS have organized numerous conferences, seminars, and workshops on many and various topics of study. In a sense, with this conference, we are continuing the same exercise, but with a few differences. We have hoped to be as comprehensive as possible in our approach to the field of Ismaili studies with the aim of expanding beyond just those few dominant disciplines with which Ismaili studies has been identified in the past. Should anyone in the world wish to select a single volume on Ismaili studies, they would still have to refer to the groundbreaking works authored by Dr. Farhad Daftary, mainly in the fields of history and doctrines in a broad sense. However, for all the intensive research carried out, we do not yet have a seamless narrative of Ismaili thought and philosophy, although this has all resulted in the numerous publications in different fields that the IIS has been proudly instrumental in producing. Following this conference, which I hope will be one of many to come, we hope to publish the proceedings of this conference. The ensuing volume will concentrate more specifically on Ismaili studies beyond just historical or medieval periods of the Ismaili heritage. However, of even more importance is that this conference is intended to show how the IIS has played a role in building the necessary foundation for the achievement of this highest goal. The IIS is not a confessional institution, and it has a non-polemical and non-exclusivist approach to matters of faith and intellectual life. Notwithstanding, neither the civilizational ethos or the pluralist vision in its work precludes a commitment to its own elements of identity. Is it possible to engage with matters of faith in a sincere and rigorous manner while yet remaining true to the intellectual capacity of human beings? Can we have a modern academic approach to scholarship while yet focusing on Ismaili studies? The Institute of Ismaili Studies was meant to be a practical response to these kinds of questions, and the answer is also found in the ethical and intellectual underpinnings of Ismaili thought, wherein there is no conflict between faith and intellect. There have been many misperceptions about Ismailis throughout ages, and the IIS has contributed significantly to correcting some of those. Among them is the deeply ideological and widespread belief that there is a dichotomy between faith and intellect and between faith and the world. How can we maintain a degree of criticality, not cynicism, while genuinely studying faith and studying faith-related subjects and faith communities? The IIS is a response or a search for a responsible response to these questions. In this conference, as in any other academic conference, we will hear a diverse range of opinions and positions, and the search for truth comes out of the interactions among these views. The concerted efforts of various scholars and practitioners in the field will help us achieve a more coherent, more rigorous, and more reliable understanding of these questions and offer sustainable responses to them. Before concluding my brief remarks and handing over to Dr. Daftary for the keynote address, I would like to point out that this conference will not be the last of its kind. Within the limits of our resources, we have not been able to include as many scholars as we might have wished to participate, and for this, we beg your forbearance. As we learn from our experience, we hope in the future to be able to spread the welcome and much further than what we have already done so far. Before handing over the floor to Dr. Daftary, there are a couple of housekeeping remarks. First of all, we have no planned fire drills, so if you hear the alarm, please follow the exit signs. Please kindly keep your phones on silent mode for the duration of the conference. And we also have a book stand here for the publications of the IIS that anybody would like to purchase. We all at the Institute of Ismaili Studies hope you will enjoy the conference and wish you all a very pleasant and informative time here with us at the Al Khan Center. Thank you.
Thank you, Daryoush. Well, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this conference, which is the first of its kind, actually, convened by our institute. It's really wonderful to see so many friends and colleagues and also familiar faces, in the room to see today. It's a great, really joy. As Daryoush mentioned, we had two objectives in mind in organizing this conference, to really take stock of the field of Ismaili studies and to see what sort of progress in its various themes have occurred in the last, I would say, 50 to 60 years, and also to showcase, to see selectively some of the contributions of our institute. Since I don't have more than about 20 minutes, I shall try to be brief and just cover some of the highlights that I would like to share with you. As you all know, the Ismailis, at least until perhaps the 1930s or 40s, were primarily and perhaps even exclusively studied and judged and evaluated on the basis of evidence that was collected or very often fabricated by their adversaries. As a result of which a range of misrepresentations and myths were fabricated, and they were put into circulation both in Europe and in the Islamic world. And these sort of legends, which actually included the black legend fabricated by anti-Ismaili Sunni polemicists and the assassin legends, the so-called assassin legends of the Crusaders and their Occidental sources. These legends, circulated widely, as I mentioned, and in time, in due course, came to be accepted as accurate descriptions of Ismaili teachings and practices. The Orientalists of the 19th century, who, starting with their doyen, Sylvester Sassi, who started their more scientific study of Islam based on Islamic manuscripts, acquired, of course, a much better understanding of Islam and the various branches of Islam, including the Ismailis. But in studying the Ismailis, they had no choice but to base themselves on the Sunni sources, which reflected the Sunni perspectives And they were, of course, also familiar with the medieval European assassin legends. So unwittingly, unknowingly, they too lent their seal of approval to these legends. And this situation actually continued, and you see all of this misinformation, misrepresentation of the community was due to the fact that genuine Ismaili sources had not been made available to scholars. For instance, in 1922, when Louis Massignon took stock of the then known literature of the Ismailis in a chapter that he contributed to Edward Brown's Festschrift, the knowledge of Europeans regarding Ismaili sources was still extremely limited. And in the following year, in 1923, when Jidolasi O'Leary published what was perhaps the first monograph on the Fatimid Caliphate, not a single Ismaili source was cited in this work. But things were actually about to change in the sense that the genuine sources produced by the Ismailis and held in manuscript collections in Yemen, in Syria, in Persia, Afghanistan, Central Asia, and India were slowly becoming available to scholars. This process really started in Syria, from where the earliest manuscripts of the community were access to scholars. They were sent to Paris, the center of Orientalism at the time. And later on, in the opening decades of the 20th century, smaller collection of such manuscripts were recovered from Yemen and Central Asia, the region of Badakhshan. But the real progress in modern Ismaili studies really took off in 1930s in India, and mainly starting with the contributions of Vladimir Ivanov, who in 1931 was commissioned by Aga Khan III to study formally in a systematic manner the history and thought of the Ismaili community. And this also made it possible for Ivanov to find access to various collections of Ismaili manuscripts, not only those held by the Nizari community, but also those held by the Mustali and Tayyibi community. And as a result of this, he was actually able in 2 years' time, in 1933, to publish a guide to Ismaili to the literature, which really provided the first scientific frame for the scholars in the field. And in this catalog, Ivanov had identified some 700 titles, which attested to the richness and diversity of Ismaili literature. At the same time, as Ivanov had started his work in Bombay, a group of Bora scholars, including Hussain Hamdani, Asaf Faizi, and Zahid Ali, who had significant collections of manuscripts of their own, and they had been educated in England, they too began to produce valuable work in the field. And as a result of all of this, we had the genesis really of modern scholarship in the field. And later on, in 1946, through the efforts again of Ivanov and under the patronage of Sultan Muhammad Shah Aga Khan III, the Ismaili Society of Bombay was founded, and this provided for the first time institutional impetus to the field. And they also had a library which at its peak held some 600 manuscripts, which subsequently were transferred to our institute in the same way that the Hamdani and Zahid Ali collections too was subsequently actually donated to the Institute of Ismaili Studies. Now, Ivanov himself actually edited and published a vast number of Persian Ismaili texts, all produced within the Nizari-Ismaili community, and he also made these manuscripts available to other scholars, including especially Henri Corbin, which had his own series of publications, Bibliothèque Iranienne. And meanwhile, another generation of scholars had really started to study the field and to publish works. And so by 1950s and 60s, many of these texts had been critically edited and published, and quite significant, really, progress was made in various branches of Ismaili studies. For instance, you had the work of Madelung and Stern, which shed light on the early history of the community in terms of law. Asaf Feyzi had done groundbreaking work, and Professor Poonawala built on that, on his work, and made major contributions to Ismaili jurisprudence. Ismaili philosophy, you had Paul Walker and Daniel Smith. In terms of the history, especially Fatimid history, you have a number of scholars, including especially Heinz Hall, who produced the standard 3-volume history of the Fatimids, and also regional. New attention was paid to regional traditions of the Ismailis. Especially the Satpanth tradition of the South Asian Khoja Ismailis, and here the works of Professor Ali Asani, of course, made major contributions. And so all of this really sort of reflected how significant the progress in the field had been. And for instance, it was in this context that Marshall Hodgson was enabled to publish his really academic work, which was really the first academic work on the Nizari Ismaili community of the Alamut period, which now replaced an earlier monograph published in German originally in 1818 by Joseph von Hammer, which was nothing but repetition of the tales and legends and the misrepresentations of the Ismailis. Meanwhile, the Institute of Ismaili Studies had come into being through the efforts of His Highness the Agha Khan, the fourth Agha Khan, in 1977. And the Institute was fortunate to have a collection of course, this collection was built over time. At present, it actually numbers perhaps more than 3,000 volumes of Arabic, Persian, and in Arabic, Persian, and Indic languages, including 600 Khojki manuscripts. And this perhaps is the largest single collection of these manuscripts that one finds in one place. And these manuscripts are put at the disposal of not only our own scholars, but they are made accessible to scholars free of charge actually, worldwide. And these, you see, manuscripts have really served to provide the basis for a new, really, phase in Ismaili studies. And we also have managed to build our own faculty. We have currently more than 30 full-time PhD scholars on our faculty, which is perhaps the largest number of such scholars gathered in any one institution in Europe. And the result of the research conducted by our scholars, which very often also collaborate with external scholars, including many of the names that I mentioned and many of whom are present actually here today. They have appeared that publications. We've so far managed to publish some 160 books in some 5 or 6 different series, including especially the Ismaili text and translation series, and the Shi'i heritage series, and the special series is devoted to the epistles produced by the Ikhwan al-Safa, where the work of Professor Carmelo Baffioni is the key contributor. More than 20 scholars actually have contributed and are contributed in this massive project, which will be completed in 25 volumes, of which 20 have already appeared. Now, all of this has made it possible for us to also be engaged in the production of an encyclopedia of the Ismailis, which inshallah will be published within about 2 years' time. So, to conclude, as a result of this modern scholarship in Ismaili studies, many of the medieval legends and misrepresentations, which reflected either the hostility or the imaginative ignorance of earlier generations, have been deconstructed, and inshallah, with further progress in the field, the remaining misrepresentations will also be dissipated. Thank you very much for listening.
Good morning, friends and colleagues. So, introducing an anthology of Gināns, issued in 1954, its publisher makes a rather provocative observation about the composers and their works featured in the book. The publisher first sets the scene by explaining how the descendants of what he calls the authoritative peers, following in the footsteps of their ancestors, carried out the work of Dawah and composed Gināns. Labeled as Sadat and Wakils, these descendants were appointed by Ismaili Imams to collect religious dues and carry out preaching activities, who thereby functioned an important link between the Imams and their followers in India. But these remarks are immediately followed by a firm warning to the readers, as he writes, and I quote, "Bear in mind that several Ismaili poets, philosophers, and devotees had propagated Ismaili Satpanth faith by composing poetry. Whatever those Sayyids instructed and whatever Gināns they composed continue to adorn our religious literature, and it is important for us to grasp the teachings embodied in their works. But the Gināns composed by the Sayyids cannot be accorded the same status and significance as those composed by the authoritative peers so designated by the Imams." End quote. The anthology produced over 200 Gināns, the bulk of which are attributed to Imam Shah, the youngest son of Hassan Kabiruddin. Other figures whose compositions appeared in the anthology include those traditionally held to be from the lineage of Kabiruddin, or ones believed to have been active for the spread of Satpanth teachings. The anthology was published by Ismaili Association for India, which then formed part of a network of trans-regional institutions mandated with the religious edification of Nizari Ismailis. Given that such remarks were made in a book endowed with an official institutional stature, these cannot be simply dismissed as a matter of individual opinion. Rather, they were meant to inculcate in the audience's mind a specific understanding of the history of Gināns and their composers. The anthology, being part of a 4-volume series, starkly constructs a binary between the status of the supposed composers of Ginān literature, namely the authoritative peers on one hand and Sayyids and other functionaries on the other, with the former accorded a superior status within the Satpanth bureaucratic structure. One might ask, what possibly could have been the source for this rigid distinction? For instance, do we find any clues to this effect in the very Gināns which the publisher so demoted? On the contrary, for one key side where the status of this composer tends to get ratified are the signature verses, which invariably refer to Imam Shah and several other composers featured in the anthology as peers, in the same way as the signature verses of the Gināns attributed to the so-called authoritative peers. But even this glaring fact, staring right into the face of the publisher, couldn't do anything to shake off its ideological inhibition towards fostering the kind of hierarchical distinction that I just mentioned. In fact, the publisher's intervention apparently turned out to be too embarrassing to sustain without the corresponding evidence of signature verses, it seems, for in the second edition of the same anthology, issued in 1969, the publisher conveniently replaced the title Peer with Sayyid from signature verses. Just for those who read Gujarati, I have a visual to give the comparison of the two editions where the title Peer has been replaced with Sayyid. Neither was this an isolated incident. Interventions of similar kind permeate the publications issued from official and other channels ever since the printing press made such books available on a large scale. What the case of this anthology and other similar examples point to is a deep-seated relationship between ideologically motivated modifications on one hand and the construction and fostering of institutionalized knowledge systems on the other, which in turn shaped a given community's self-perception, identity, and sense of history. In this paper, I seek to engage with these issues by focusing on select hagiographies of two important saints revered in the Satpanth tradition, which serve as an important archive to study the interplay between ideological and historical configurations I have alluded to. These saints are Shams Afzwari, with whom the tradition ascribes numerous Gināns and is seen as a key progenitor of the tradition, and Imam Shah, who, as my opening comments indicated, remains a contested figure. Before I move on to discuss these hagiographies, a word about their character is in order. The hagiographic materials about the Satpanthi saints are largely embodied in the Gināns, as well as in many subsequent accounts produced within different segments of the associated communities. These materials have previously been utilized by scholars mainly to reconstruct the origins and development of Ismaili tradition in South Asia, especially focusing on the mission and teachings of the saints, whose lives and biographical details were assumed to sit at the core of the web of narratives and stories passed down for centuries. Hence, through a painstaking examination of these hagiographies, scholars have sought to shed light on specific matters concerning the biographies of the saints and to clear the dust in an attempt to bring us closer to an idealized historical past. In such an endeavor, of course, there is very little in hagiographic repertoire that would be of direct interest to scholars: dates, places, names, plausibility of actual occurrences of certain events, and so on. In consequence, a great deal of material, especially stories of wonders and marvels, was deemed to be of little value. What W. Ivano once described as pious trash, not reliable facts, and silliest stories of miracles that people believed in blindly. I am precisely interested in these silliest stories for the simple reason that whether they may or may not tell us anything substantial about a given saint's actual or imagined life, they surely tell us a great deal about the people who nurtured them, kept them closer to their heart, retold them with embellishments, and at times with ideologically motivated interventions. Turning to Shams Afzwari, he arguably represents the most colorful and enigmatic of the saints revered by the Satpanth communities and beyond, around whom a plethora of hagiographic tales and legends have developed. An important factor contributing to the rich tapestry of legends and stories developed around Shams is the fact that he has been confounded with his three other namesakes, namely Shams Tabriz, the spiritual master of Jalaluddin Rumi, the Qasim Shahi Imams Shamsuddin Muhammad, and the Nur Bakshi Saint Shamsuddin Iraqi. And while the conflation between these figures is well known in scholarship, what perhaps needs to be underlined is that the amalgamation of hagiographies surrounding their lives has accumulated over time in different settings and regions with potentially different motivations and far from being brought about in a single body of sources. Thus, the caretakers of the Mausoleum of Pir Shams Afzwari in Multan, together with its countless visitors, have long regarded Shams Afzwari and Shams Tabriz one and the same person, entwined in a complex set of stories and motifs that Ivano described as Konya to Multan legends. Similarly, the conflation between Qasim Shahi Imam Shamsuddin Muhammad and Shams Tabriz on one hand, and that between the Imam and Shams Afzwari on the other, seemingly grew in dispersed Ismaili and other circles in Badakhshan and India. In the development of the extensive body of hagiographies woven around the multiple figures of Shams, many of which gradually acquired local elements, the Satpanth tradition played an important part through Gināns and later through communal narratives. In the interest of time, I shall focus here on one story and its representation in Gināns and some other later hagiographies, namely the encounter between Shams and Bahauddin Zikriya, the 13th century Sohrawardi saint. The story goes like this. Having arrived in Multan, one day Shams decides to go for a sail, but finding no boat, he brings about a paper boat and goes for an excursion in it. Bahauddin happens to see this from his window, becomes jealous, and causes the boat to sink through his powers. Shams, however, rescues the boat, notices the ill intentions of Bahauddin, and curses him back so that two horns grow out of his head, causing him to be trapped in the window. Realizing Shams's power, Bahauddin asks his son to seek forgiveness. Shams forgives Bahauddin but warns that the horns marks would always remain even in his progeny. Being worried about the presence of Shams in the town, Bahauddin sends a cup filled with milk, indicating that the city has no more capacity for saints. To this, Shams puts a flower in the cup and returns it, indicating that his presence in the town would be untroublesome. The legend is recounted in various details in many Gināns, especially in Momin Chitamani and Satvarni Vardi. What is noteworthy about the last part of the legend is that in Sufi hagiographies, the same story is related in connection with Bahauddin, where he becomes the protagonist and sends the cup with a flower in it to rival and jealous Sufis in Multan. So the Ginān narratives clearly use a widely dispersed motif to represent the encounter between the two saints and especially to underline the friendly gesture of Shams. But where the Gināns go a step further is to constantly depict Bahauddin as the arch-rival of Shams. He is called Adharmi, unbeliever, and portrayed as causing repeated troubles for Shams during his stay in the city. The rival relationship between Bahauddin and Shams, however, takes on a different color in quite a few later Satpanthi communal accounts, wherein their authors seem to give a sense of a rapprochement between the two saints after Shams's friendly gesture. Bahauddin is not demonized in these accounts in the way we see it in the Gināns. In this connection, in a 19th century Imam Shahi hagiographical work, Manazilul Aqtab, we find early Satpanthi saints being presented as members of the Sohrawardi order. Could this change in attitude from vilification to acceptance perhaps represent an effort to come to terms with more historically grounded realities about the origins of the Satpanth and the character of its early saints? For there are traditions about close linkages, for example, between Kabiruddin's relationship with the Sohrawardi order in Uch. While it is not possible to go any further on this point beyond highlighting this trend, it is worth noting that a similar trend of rapprochement and cordial relationship between Shams and Sohrawardi Sufis is portrayed through the official biographical notices at Shams Afzwari's shrine, perhaps in an effort to counterbalance the popular perception of rivalry between the two saints. Before leaving Shams, a final point worth highlighting is how in many modern communal histories, we see the repertoire of legends concerning Shams grow extensively. This is partly due to the availability of a range of historical and other sources which were utilized by the authors of these histories. But this also set in motion a new phase in the fostering of concerned hagiographies, which were now repackaged for a new audience. The availability of new information allowed the emerging writers to creatively rethink the role of the saints in the tradition. A relevant case here is the work of Ali Muhammad Jan Muhammad Chunara, Nur Mubin. Chunara provides a wealth of data about these figures of Shams and sifts it carefully to present a historical and biographical details about their lives. But this approach falls apart to a significant degree when it comes to hagiographic materials, where we see him confounding traditions and stories associated with different figures of Shams. Perhaps it is this tendency which leaves its mark on the pictorial depictions of Shams al-Zawari and Shams Tabriz produced in the book. Both the portraits that you see on the screen, other than the fact they carry different names, anything but look different. I shall now turn to discuss a few stories surrounding the figure of Imam Shah, who, as I indicated in my opening remarks, represents a deeply contested figure among the Satpanthi communities, especially insofar as his status vis-a-vis his father's succession is concerned. The earliest body of hagiographies about Imam Shah are transmitted via certain Gināns, the most prominent of which is Jannatpuri, the city of paradise, or Jannat Nama, as it is known in Imam Shahi circles. The basic storyline of Jannatpuri revolves around the issue of Sher, Panthi. As per the Ginān, Imam Shah, being absent from Uj, a place in present-day Punjab in Pakistan, where his father died, reaches just in time to hold the burial procession and demands his share from the father's corpse. After much pleading and subjecting himself to ridicule, he finally receives a rosary and a piece of sugar as his share, and leaves for Sindh, where he is mistreated by the Khojas who refuse to accept him. From Sindh, he proceeds westward to visit the unidentified residence of the Lord, referred to as Nur Shah. Upon meeting Nur Shah, Imam Shah requests and is granted a visit to the paradise, where he meets his father and ancestors, among other mythical figures enjoying the bounties of the paradise. Despite being focused on the central question of the share, inheritance, Jannatpuri leaves it somewhat ambiguous and unresolved. First, the text never explains the significance or meaning behind the idea of the rosary and the piece of sugar that Imam Shah receives as his share. And while having witnessed the marvel, the community in Uj brings faith upon him and firmly accepts him, its validity is equally rejected by the Khojas of Sindh. The text also seemingly plays with the titles Peer, Sayyid, and Guru, each of which is repeatedly used for the same. In this connection, although Imam Shah receives due recognition from the Lord Nur Shah, and although his special status gets somewhat confirmed by being mentioned in a line of Peer stretching back to Shams through his father Kabir Din, the narrative leaves us in the dark about any subsequent events following Imam Shah's westward journey and his role in them, an issue upon which the later 19th and 20th century communal accounts were extensively focused on. However, the sheer fact that a text like Jannatpuri, with all its ambiguities, continued to circulate within the so-called mainstream Nizari and the offshoot Imam Shahi communities underscores the vitality of Imam Shah's mission and the effort on the part of respective communities to embrace and appropriate his legacy with varying permutations and necessary adjustments to advance claims of legitimacy and ideological justification. In summary, as far as the Ginanic hagiographies of Imam Shah are concerned, the issue of Imam Shah's succession is left unresolved and throws open multiple possibilities while providing space for different interpretive positions. What we then perhaps see in this unresolved contestation is an attempt to appropriate the legacy of Imam Shah in varied directions by the communities invested in the matter. The process becomes more evident with the 19th and 20th century communal histories that take these accounts to the next level and modify them as per their ideological leanings and legitimizing positions. I will discuss a few examples here. To begin with, in Manazilul Aqtab, Imam Shah is directed by his father's corpse to go to Kirman and demand his share there. Imam Shah duly travels to Persia and attains his share, which is described as a great mystery. However, the person from whom Imam Shah is asked to seek the share is called Sajjada Nashin and not named Nur Shah. But unlike Jannatpuri, Manazilul Aqtab continues the narrative by describing Imam Shah's return journey to India and his settlement and propagation in Gujarat. Similarly, another Imam Shahi work, Tawarikh-e-Pir, follows the narrative of Manazilul Aqtab, but here Imam Shah is admonished to visit the Dargah of Jafar as-Sadiq, which he complies. Tawarikh-e-Pir, though, does not omit Imam Shah's meeting with Nur Shah in Kirman, except that he is called the Wali-e-Kamil of his age. When Imam Shah asks for his share from the Wali-e-Kamil, he is assured that with his father's blessings, all the spiritual and worldly powers have already been bestowed upon him. In this way, the two Imam Shahi works, issued from the circles closely linked to the progeny of Imam Shah, treat the episode of his share in a way to legitimize the independent mission of Imam Shah. On the other hand, the modern Ismaili works adopted a different attitude to Imam Shah's legacy. For example, Chunara categorically declares that when denied the rank of Pir in Iran, Imam Shah became disappointed and began his new religion. Chunara's account thus adopts a very different line from the hagiographic traditions in Gināns and Imam Shahi works. But as the case of Ginanic anthology I discussed in the beginning shows, there was also an effort within Ismaili circles to appropriate his legacy, but by diminishing his status within the Satpanth bureaucratic hierarchy. Before leaving the hagiographies of Imam Shah, it is worth pointing out a radically different, albeit somewhat contemporary trend portraying Imam Shah along altogether different lines. Drawing upon the same pool of hagiographies but appropriating it to its own ideological ends, this trend may be seen in the historical and doctrinal works issued from the shrine of Imam Shah in Pirana, in Gujarat, which is controlled largely by the Hindu followers of the saint. Bent on introducing a Hindutva-informed ideology within the customs and operations of the shrine and disconnecting all its ties with Muslim Imam Shahi section, the publications specially use visual imagery to depict Imam Shah as a Hindu sage. And I have a couple of examples where you can see the transformation that Imam Shah's imagery goes through in the way he is depicted as a Hindu sage. To sum up, the kind of interventions and modifications that I hope to show through the case of select hagiographies did not operate in isolation, insulated from larger trends and developments. Rather, they were rooted in socio-cultural, religious, and political exigencies of their time, aimed at legitimizing the ideological positions and leanings of concerned communities in dialogue with internal and external interlocutors. Thus, such modifications were often accompanied by corresponding adjustments to historical and doctrinal narratives underpinning them, and it is in those narratives that we see the birth and making of Satpanth historiography. Thank you.
Thank you, Wafi. We will move on to a speaker on Zoom now. It'll be Soumen Mukherjee, who will speak about his work on the study of religion in modern South Asia, focusing in particular on retrieving a period where there was intense and sincere engagement with mysticism.
A very good morning, good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be able to share a part of my ongoing research with you all today. And I hope you'll bear with the programmatic tone of this presentation. This is because this is a work in progress. It's an ongoing project, and full-fledged and definitive thesis is not yet out there, but I can see that some of the questions which are on the anvil can lead to some of the core questions that might be also useful for us, given the larger the core idea behind the conference, where we are going to talk about Ismaili studies, and also we are going to do a bit of a stock taking about the state of the field. So I hope this is in consonance with the larger theme of the conference. One of the first things that we need to understand is that that the esotericism and mysticism hadn't had really much good name after all if you're doing religious studies, because for the better part of 19th century, even as there is a Religionswissenschaft evolving, so-called science of religion, the esoteric or the mystical, they do not quite figure. I mean, it is often marginalized and it is actually frowned upon. But there are interesting kind of developments, though, and an interesting figure here would be Cornelis Petrus Steele, who talks about the science of religion, but also talks about, well, not just history of religion, but also anthropology, sociology, and psychology, which is really interesting because that is what he really, tries to kind of invoke to talk about the inner recesses. Across the Atlantic, in the later part of the 19th century, early 20th century, you have William James in his Varieties of Religion. He's talking about the psychological aspect. And of course, if you're looking at American context, there is a much larger world of American transcendentalism. And in Victorian England, you also have similar kind of cases. But how much of this is actually entering this burgeoning Wissenschaft is something that needs to be critically revisited. But here we go. There is this Cornelis Steele. There could be this William James across Atlantic in America, who are also trying to talk about the inner recesses of human mind and what stories they have to tell and how best they help us appreciate the idea of religion. Much of this scholarship in the 19th century, obviously, they're products of their time, like anything else as well, is also part of a larger problem of civilizational hierarchies and stereotypings of different order, religious, cultural, racial. So you have Otto Pfleiderer, an Orientalist theologian, who is talking about a Persian Islamism of the Aryan variety contra the Semitic Arabian Islamism. And by Persian Islamism, he's referring to the Sufistic kind of variety, and he's going to kind of foreground that vis-a-vis the Semitic Arab. And obviously the racial stereotypes are very clear, because if you're looking at the legalistic Semites as opposed to the contemplative speculative Aryans, there is a long history to it. Now, how does it connect to our story? This becomes important because in the 1860s great Aga Khan case, the defense counsel Edward Irving Howard was invoking precisely these terms, because when he was defending his case, he was talking about not going by the terminologies which the detractors of the Ismailis have imposed on them, but rather looking at the self-depicting terms of the Ismailis, namely the Ismailis or the Buttonites. And then he later went on to talk about the pivotal role of Imam Ali, the so-called, and I'm borrowing his words, more human element of the Aryan of the Aryan or the Indo-European spirit, rather than the the Semitic spirit of the Arab Sunnis. So you see that it kind of connects to a particular moment in Ismaili history when it is searching for its identity in terms of Shia contra Sunni, this kind of basic understanding of the problem, and that has a very specific British colonial judicial, English colonial judicial context in the later half of the 19th century in India, obviously with different kind of ramifications. Also crucial to the process was a process of canonization eventually down the line. The way, for example, the Dasavatar, where the text came to be kind of canonized, where the Hindu elements were purged, and how the specific Muslim Islamic elements were kind of canonized and gave shape to a particular Ismaili identity, is something that has been critically commented upon by Tina Purohit, and I'm not going to get into the details, but it is almost clear that this is not yet Ismaili studies, but the early stirrings to talk about an identity in these terms, in the terms of religious denomination, in the terms of racial stereotypes, they're also part of this history. They're part of this history even as we talk about their pre-modern encounters, and we talk about how spiritual dissimulation kind of was a way to resolve the problem of having to live in a very hostile environment. That is a critical argument that has been invoked by a whole range of scholarly interventions, and there is obviously much sense in this, but also we need to understand what exactly does it mean to talk about these pre-modern religio-cultural encounters. So it is one thing to talk about in search of equivalence, meaning that different communities, different groups are coming and talking to each other, exchanging notes, interacting, encountering, and trying to make sense of others' idioms and looking for a language which they can both speak. That is the first basic rule of a meaningful conversation, knowing each other's language. So there is this quest for these, idioms of equivalence, as Tony Stewart talks about. But I'm trying to shift the attention not to the question of looking for this equivalence, but rather the different agendas, the different iterations. There could be a shared vocabulary, but there could be different meanings attached to that and eventually different agendas down the line. And how best do we do that? So even as we talk about this enormous corpus of Ginān literature and this fascinating scholarship by a range of towering scholars in the field who have very meticulously kind of excavated this Ginān literature and tried to make sense of what stories they have to tell. We also need to understand that this is something that we need to juxtapose with the other iterations. The other iterations meaning who are the other communities that the Ismailis of the pre-modern times were talking to? What are the different kind of stories possibly that we can get here? How, for example, the Pir Patho could be compared to Gopichand, and if you're talking about, for example, such a community as the Natha Yogis, which is extremely peripatetic and have translocal, trans-regional narratives, you might actually you might be interested to look at different regional, local, and cultural iterations of certain narratives, the certain core narratives, and that is something that we need to understand. So much as we talk about in Ismaili studies where there is a particular idea of a denominational specificity yoked to a particular understanding of Islam, how this balance could be struck, it's a very interesting, delicate balance. Much as we talk about that, much as we talk about the institutional endeavors of the likes of Vladimir Ivanov and the first generation, as scholars have shown, we also need to understand that these denominations, the way these communities would look at themselves, is also a way to kind of look at themselves vis-a-vis burgeoning discourses, which in the 19th century context often became kind of impositions on identities, on their identities, which are at odds with these overarching identities. Also critical to the late 19th, early 20th century scholarship is the way this passage from oral traditions happened through these, this excavation of all these pre-modern manuscript cultures and then the modern redactions. Which of the recensions of maybe a certain text might have 3 or 4 different recensions? Which of these recensions could be accepted? Which may or may not be accepted? And that is a larger kind of trajectory that we need to understand, a larger process that we need to understand and problematize with reference again to all these different regional and the cultural iterations. So we really need to kind of juxtapose this with the other kind of possibilities, and a lot of these might open up new areas, meaning that the way bhakti, the way tantra or yoga or Sufism, each of these very interesting categories, each of these very interesting conceptual frameworks, and they require critical reflection in their own historical context. And what stories do they have to tell if one were to look at their histories in their own times? And that is something that requires us to problematize also these scholars from the late 19th, early 20th century, to and their scholarship, their ideas, because we are at the end of the day looking at pre-modern histories, early medieval histories, trying to reach out to some quote-unquote classical through the lens of the scholarship. And a major question here becomes, this heightened interest in the esoteric and the heightened interest in the mystical. Often kind of frowned upon in this colonial epistemic discourse, this becomes actually an interesting side in the sense that it becomes an important kind of alternative, an important kind of important riposter to the colonial epistemic kind of hegemony, because the idea of the mystical, the idea of the esoteric provides the colonial the nationalist scholars, the Indian scholars of the late 19th, early 20th century with a kind of with an epistemological toolkit to respond to a colonial hegemony in very interesting ways and very creative ways. So in the late 19th century, Akhay Kumar Dotto, in his Bharatvarshya Upashak Sampradaya, which is a text in Bengali on India's religious communities, even as it talks about different religions of the Aryan family, he also takes all the trouble to go to discuss at length the diverse sampradayas or denominations and popular and folk religious cults. Goes on to talk about Kabirpanthis, goes on to talk about the owls and the bowls and the very interesting kind of um, religio-cultural interactions that defines the spirit of these pre-modern interactions. Um, by the early 20th century, you have the Rabindranath Tagore, Kirti Mohan Sen, Evelyn Underhill circle, and a key outcome of this endeavor, of their collective endeavor, was this 100 poems of Kabir, published in 1915 from London by the Indian Society. And Evelyn Underhill, the leading commentator on Christian mysticism, actually wrote the introduction to this and went on to say that Kabir belongs to that small group of supreme mystics, amongst whom St. Augustine, Rusbrook, and the Sufi poet Jalaluddin Rumi are perhaps the chief, who have achieved that which we might call the synthetic vision of God. I like to stress the synthetic vision of God. You know, the synthetic, the idea of the synthetic, the idea of synthesis is actually the fulcrum of, is actually the pivot of Tagore's discourse of a syncretic Indian civilization. And that obviously kind of, acquires very interesting dimensions and afterlives in the years to come. Underhill would also, in a seminal essay on mysticism, go on to say that they, that is the mystics, are far more like each other than they are like the average believer in their several creeds. So all religions, different religions have mystics. All the great religions have their mystics. And these mystics actually operate at a plane on their own. They are far more connected to each other than they are connected to their respective religions, which is a kind of fascinating argument of a kind of of an intellectual autonomy, almost of a religious and intellectual autonomy at the hands of these early 20th century scholars, which go on to kind of critique the structured idea of religion and world religions and try to work out a space within which specific identities could be worked out, but not so specific that they become cut off and hermetically sealed and become insular, but rather talk about also our universalist aspirations. And that is what we need to kind of critically reflect on. I want to now kind of wrap up this discussion, and like I said, that these are going to be more like self-reflexive questions, and I would welcome you to join in this self journey to along self-reflexive lines. Could we then kind of think about, even as we oscillate from these specificities and these universalist aspirations, could we then talk about this esoteric and the mystical, um, without necessarily invoking all these qualifiers and the prefixes, like this Christian contra the Hindu contra the Islamic, often Christian mysticism, Hindu mysticism, Islamic mysticism. How best do we connect to the realm of mysticism, and what exactly does it mean for these mystics in their own times to be able to talk about that? This is not so much a kind of simply a kind of very passive way of kind of idealizing something to the point that they do not have any application, they do not have any strategic or tactical aspect in their own times. That is not what I'm saying, I'm suggesting. What I'm saying instead though is that in the way the different mystics could be trying to reach out to their roots, and b also this transcendental realm of the universal, could we try to find out, could we try to see what exactly they might mean? And I believe and I suspect that if one were to talk about Ismaili studies vis-a-vis what these medieval the saints, the Sant tradition, the Kabirpanthis and similar such traditions, for instance, a couple of illustrative cases, that is all I'm referring to. There could be many more. Once we do that, it might actually make sense it might actually help us better appreciate their own individual narratives, their own individual stories. We need to kind of widen the horizon to see what narratives, what stories, what iterations of stories they have to tell us. So the core issues, once we look at this burgeoning Ismaili studies vis-a-vis this contemporaneous scholarship and bhakti, these are obviously contemporaneous. The birth of Ismaili studies since the early 20th century, the evolution of Ismaili studies since the early 20th century, and the heightened interest in the bhakti, Sufi, and medieval mystical traditions, they're actually roughly within the same time frame. And that is something that we can, as students of history of religion, benefit from. So this is roughly, as I said, more or less the set of questions that I'm trying to understand, and I hope to be able to share more cogent and concrete ideas in the coming days. But of course, this is, as I said, is more self-reflexive, and hope connects to some of the questions that the conference had at its very core, namely, taking a stock of the state of scholarship. Hopefully, they might help us, they might guide us in the right direction, and give us more cases to draw upon. Not just Ismaili studies, but Ismaili studies in conversation with similar kind of scholarly oeuvres since the early 20th century. This is obviously focused on the South Asian case, but I should add that by all means there could be similar iterations, similar kind of cases from other parts of the world as well. And here is a select bibliography, a very select bibliography of the secondary sources that I've been citing. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for your attention.
We will now move on to Asani on transnationalizing the Gināns.
Okay, so it's my pleasure to present some of my own research on the Gināns. This is a topic that I've been working on for many decades, and just as one studies more, one thinks, learns more, and then constantly revising things. So what I'm presenting today is very much a work in progress. And just because of the amount of material that I have that actually underlies this presentation, I'm not going to be able to cover everything because that's only 20 minutes. So what can you do in 20 minutes? So I just wanted to refer you to two works on which my presentation is based on, if people want more details. One is one that I did for in a publication edited by Dr. Daftary on Satpanthi to Ismaili Muslim. And the other one is a more recent one, which is looking at the Gināns, I'm calling it between Satpanthi scripture and Ismaili devotional literature. So, so I wanted to start first with a way in which I've been thinking about the Gināns, which is different from looking at the Gināns just as text, because very often when you look at Gināns, we look at them as text and then you analyze the text. I've been more interested in recent years in doing what's been called a religio-history of the Gināns. And by this, I mean you examine the changing roles that they play in the lives of the community, as the various communities. And I want to emphasize, it's not just the Ismaili communities. I'm also interested in communities that don't identify themselves as Ismaili, but who are still reciting Gināns, albeit in slightly different renditions. So we look at this religio-history and looking at how, as the socio-political environment of these communities change, how the role of the Gināns changes and how they think about the Ginān changes. So, and of course, because there are many communities, there are several communities that do recite the Gināns, you can trace this through various different lenses. I'm picking here the lens that I'm more familiar with, and that is the one of the Ismaili Khojas. but one could do a similar analysis of other communities as well. Now, what my work has been showing is that as the Khojas, or who today are called Ismaili Khojas, there, if you go back historically, there's an evolution of identity. So there's this first stage, pre-modern, I would say pre-colonial, what's called Satpanth. And interestingly, the Gināns don't use the word Ismaili at all, not even one. It's always called Satpanth. Satpanth, and I'll talk about this in a few minutes. So the first identity is you're part of what's called Satpanth. Then the Satpanth evolves, I would say, in the 19th, early 20th century. And so those Khojas that remain that identified Ismaili then call themselves Satpanth Ismailis. And then eventually in the mid to late 20th century, you get the label changing again to Nizari Ismaili Muslims. So you get the formal identifications of these communities changing. They're responding to different socio-political changes in the surrounding society. And as those change, you see a change in the function of the Gināns. And you go from the Gināns, at least in this community, go from being a normative scripture to, in fact, what I'm forming a liturgical text or a devotional literature. Now, first of all, I wanted to just emphasize the way I'm using the word scripture. And in this, I drew on the work of William Graham, a teacher and colleague of mine also, who has done a lot of work on this idea of scripture. And he talks about how, based, of course, on his work on the Quran, that how oral texts, things that are orally transmitted, can also form the role of scripture. Because generally, when we talk about scripture, you think of codified text, a written book, and so on. That's the traditional way. But he actually makes the argument that oral texts that are can play the same role as written text. And he said what defines a scripture is not the form, the physical form of it, but the text becomes scripture when a community of believers perceive them to be holy, transcendent, powerful, and authoritative. So it's communities that decide what is scripture and what is not. It's not the actual form itself. And then building on this work, we see that scriptures, generally speaking, operate at three different levels. There's a semantic level, where these texts that are considered scriptures lead to construction, not only meaning of the text and its interpretation, but also become very powerful in determining personal and communal norms, like what is normative and how you understand your faith. But they also have a performative aspect to them. And then they have an iconic aspect to them as well. And in all these three dimensions, you find that with texts that are in religious context are ritualized. So based on this, I wanted to I've been looking at, I'm just going to run through these first couple of slides to show that how in the pre-18th, I would say the pre-colonial era, and this is sort of picking up on what Soumen actually has talked about as well, is that Satpanth, as it was defined, actually was a really widespread movement. It included groups, castes, I think jats of many different varieties, and I've named some of these. And each of them seems to have had a very distinctive tradition of peers, of people that they invoked. Sometimes they also had a professional affiliation. We know, for example, Shamsis were goldsmiths and so on and so forth. And that in this pre-colonial period, these formulations were not stable and were not static. Each of these groups is changing in its dynamic and so on. And there are schisms, like as Wafi mentioned, the Khoja Imam Shahi split and so on. So we shouldn't think about this thing as monolithic or stable. But what is interesting in these groups is that they all are referring to what today we're calling the Gināns, or these texts associated with these various peers. These texts have play a very important semantic role. Their worldviews and so on are determined by what these texts that they're reciting and performing, albeit in slightly modified forms. But the semantic dimension is very important. The performative is very important, as is the iconic. So, and what is interesting about these Satpanth tradition itself is that it is polyvalent, that it is using multiple discourses, drawing on many different, on the one hand, there are references, allusions to Ismaili, but there's also the reference, Quran emerges in some of these Gināns, and like Satpanth is a manifestation of Quranic ideals. There's references like that in there. But the Sufi, the Vaishnavite, the Bhakti, so there are all these multiple discourses, which actually shows that the Satpanth tradition was in dialogue with all these communities of religious difference. And then, therefore, it was appealing to peoples of these different backgrounds. And that's what I mean by this tradition being polyvalent. Now, these Satpanthi identities in the late 19th and early 20th century were reformulated, again, because the context changes, and they come out into the 20th century as along the lines of monolithic religious denominations. So you start getting Ismailis and Ithnashari and Sunni and Hindus and devotees of Ramdev, Imam Shahis, all these identities become crystallized, not so much in ethnic or social identity terms as caste groups or so on, but as religious denomination. And there are several reasons for this, and this is again just summarizing some of this research that I've already done. The impact of British colonial rule is very important here, because with the British, the impositions of Western conceptions of what is religion and what counts as religion come in, again, something that Soumen talked about. And necessarily, this idea of categorizing people as isms and Hindu and Muslim, and what you find is that these kinds of polyvalent traditions are seen as very confusing to the colonial state. We don't know what to make out of you. Are you Hindu? Are you Muslim? How do we categorize you? And so groups are forced to go through this process of redefinition. The coming of the Aga Khan, the first into South Asia, also had was an important factor in this, because this leads eventually to the reformulation of identity in denominational terms, like Ismaili, Khoja, and so on. And there's a whole lot of literature that we can look at there. And then the rise of religiously based nationalisms in South Asia, Muslims and Hindus being seen as separate nations, not just communities, but as nations. And then eventually with the rise of Pakistan and India, that environment also has had an effect on this, how people are now identifying themselves. What is Islamic? What is Hindu? All those questions, they start having a repercussion on the way these literatures are functioning. The diaspora becomes very important as well. And then finally, the revolution in media technology becomes very important. So now the impact of all these movements on the Gināns, as some of their, as again I outline in detail in some of my work, is that not only are these Gināns, now this is again within a Khoja Ismaili context, not only are they frozen and consolidated and canonized, but there's an attempt to also Islamize some of its vocabulary. So what in Pakistan or might be a sensitive term, like instead of using Hari, you use Ali, you use different types of terms because the context of the communities have changed. And then what you find eventually happens to the Gināns within this Ismaili context is that they no longer become the basis of normative understandings of what it means to be Nizari Ismailis. So that the Gināns are there, they're part of one's heritage, but they play more and more a liturgical role. The idea of what it means to be a Nizari Ismaili and so on, you have a greater alignment with Quranic discourse, historical discourse connecting these traditions with the Ismaili past, like the Fatimids and so on. So looking at this whole narrative. And then also this notion that these Gināns are seen as some sort of commentaries on the Quran. So the idea of the vernacular as the intermediary. Now, so these were some of the main points I wanted to make, but I want to cite here some of this very interesting work that has been done in terms of what this means in terms of the roles of the Gināns. So Karim Gilani, of course, has written this for his PhD dissertation, really looked at some of these contemporary contexts of sound and recitation. And in there, he talks about how you see a bifurcation taking place between what he calls the traditional and then he calls the new trends. But I would sort of say that in an institutional or in a liturgical context, that is how it's being recited for ritual purposes in the Jamaat-khanas and so on. It is something that there's an attempt to try to standardize, to control the liturgy in terms of the texts that are read, the texts that are recited, how long you can recite the text for a Ginān. Obviously, some texts are not recited, like the Saftara is no longer recited. So what texts get recited? And interestingly, a preliminary study of some of the texts that popularly get recited, great emphasis on the mystical and the esoteric, exactly what Soumen was talking about. And then you have this other whole sphere where you're finding these Gināns have a life beyond the institutional structures of the Ismaili community, particularly the Jamaat-khana spaces. So let's say these non-liturgical spaces. Based on, so you can see the liturgical spaces, the way in which the tradition is tied. But as opposed to when you go into the non-liturgical spaces, again, this is drawing on Karim's dissertation, you find a range of different people who are engaged with engaging with the Ginānic text. You have traditional professional musicians who are outside the Ismaili community, like Abida Parveen or Rageshwari and so on, singing Gināns. You have New Age musicians from within the community who are singing Gināns. You have trained Hindustani classical musicians. You have people, even Khoja Ismailis who are trained in Western classical music, are also thinking about the Gināns from that perspective. So you can see that the range, the ways in which the tradition is now being received in terms of an experiential tradition has become quite diverse. And what is interesting is that when you talk to some of these, like I'm thinking of people who are not formally Ismaili, like Abida Parveen, she looks at these Gināns and she was saying, well, all these poets like Waris Shah, Shah Abdul Latif, Bulle Shah, Guru Nanak, Mirabai, Pir Shams, Pir Sadaddin, they're all divinely inspired people who chose music as a tool for their messages of peace and love and humanity. So referring to this kind of universalism and why she finds singing Gināns quite appealing. that she as an artist is able to experience things in the Gināns that she connects to a larger context. Similarly, Rageshwari Lumba, who is famous also as a singer, Indian pop singer, the way she works on these, on the Gināns, she, again, this is drawing on some of Kareem's research. She and her father take verses from the Gināns, and like this one, people worship Ram or Rahman. The names and forms are different, but in reality, they are the same. Here it is a profound message which is beyond any religion. Call it Sufism or Bhaktism or religion of humanity, they're all the same. Again, this idea that they're tapping in what they see is a kind of universalism in the Gināns because of his polyvalent discourses. So people see in that polyvalent discourse a form of universalism that's touching various traditions. And I just wanted to play just a very brief selection of Rageshwari, so you'll see how she's singing a particular Ginān. And can I play it from here or can you play it from there? We're also getting various initiatives that are, I would say, some of it institutional based from outside the community, the Ismaili community, but also individuals who have taken various initiatives. Because one of the big concerns is that how do you transmit these traditions to the next generation? So, so you have various sorts of organizations, groups, and I wanted to highlight, it's too bad this. So there are various kinds of initiatives, groups that are trying to look at the Gināns not only in this performative context, but in terms of trying to transmit it to the next generation. And you have, I think some of you are familiar, Dr. Kareem Tharani at University of Saskatchewan has created, of course, this Ginān Central. And what is interesting is that this Ginān Central, he takes community-sourced contributions on Gināns, recitations, and so on. And he talks about that the University of Saskatchewan, while it is committed to being an open, inclusive environment that promotes knowledge, traditions of diverse communities. It starts out first with First Nation communities in Canada, but now it's looking at how do immigrant communities also, how can they transmit? So this Ginān Central has been working quite effectively to get community-sourced notions of Gināns and their interpretations. And then we also have this other group here, jollygool.com. Let me just move, yeah. And this is, again, an individual Ismaili initiative. Jollygool, in case you might be wondering, was it refers to this individual, Ghulam Hussain Gulmani, who used to be called Jolly Gul because he was Gul, Ghulam Hussain, but he told lots of jokes and he loved to recite Gināns, so people called him Jolly Gul. And when he passed away, his son decided to create these websites where there would be Gināns performed with music, as well as sometimes animation, and I'll show you one of these. I don't think we'll have time to show it, but there's Gināns identified as Mother's Day Gināns and so on and so forth. And it's a very interesting initiative. And again, the idea is to how do you make this accessible? And then you have, of course, this other site, Ginān Guru, which brings together very interestingly youth, Ismaili youth from different parts of the world, and creates these massive Ginān Mayfields performances, and you can have participants from 20 different countries singing in choir on Zoom. So this is just to give you a sense of this tradition. And I wanted to just sort of, again, there's much one can add, but I would like to say that this logo that Jolly Gool has about the Gināns says, Ginānify your life. So the idea is that use the knowledge of the Gināns to inform your life. So in conclusion, what I would like to say is that, when we go back to what constitutes a scripture, and Bill Graham actually talks about how the role, the significant scriptural characteristics of a text are the roles that it plays in the community, but also in individual lives. And so it is really what we're seeing here through this lens of this religious history, that even though within the community context of liturgical space, the Gināns have been now categorized as a kind of ritual text that is performed. But beyond that space, you are seeing a whole new manifestation of the Ginānic text. And what is interesting for me is that this new manifestation of the Ginānic text is making it global, it's making it pluralistic, it is engaging with different communities of interpretation, far beyond the Ismaili community, and it sort of seems to me like the circles come around. We started out from a Satpanth tradition that was engaging with difference, and now we've ended up with a tradition that still continues to engage with pluralism and diversity, but in this experiential form. So, and I think a lot of that has to do with the very nature of these Gināns and the polyvalent messages that they send. So, thank you, and apologies for the technical problem.
Our final presentation is by Hussain Jasani on reconstructing the history of Ginān printing and publication.
Do I get as much time as Professor Asani had?
No, I have technical everything. So unless you're technical.
My slides are not up. The technical difficulty. Great. While the slides are coming up, my paper is about remapping the historical perspective on the printing and publication of Satpanth Ismaili religious literature. Though I will be talking about general religious literature of the Ismailis in general, my focus is on hymn-like texts called Ginān from the Indian subcontinent. The literature is common amongst the community popularly known as Khojas, with its internal diversity of Sitpuri Momins, Kathiawadi Momins, Shamshis, Guptis, etc. As we have heard from Professor Asani, the literature is shared by many other Satpanthi communities. For the presentation today, I'll be focusing on the period from the 1860s, that is the beginning of Ginān printing, to the 1920s, when the printing literature was consolidated under community institutions. I am a student of history and have a historian as my role model, multiple historians as my role model. So my work is based on the historical evidences and looking at the text, and I'll be focusing on the history of the text rather than the content of the text. My findings about Ginān text production and circulation in pre-partition India, as well as the Indian Ocean region in the late 19th and early 20th century, differ from the established narrative and provide a different understanding of print capitalism in this region. Researchers have extensively studied Gināns. Researchers have extensively studied Ginān literature using the lenses of identity formation, we have just heard one such presentation, and Khoja-skeism, or investigated the literature for what they call its quote-unquote Hindu elements. However, most researchers have either ignored the history of publication or repeated a narrative that Chunara, whom Wafi mentioned, first introduced in the second edition of his hugely popular Gujarati book, Nuram Mubin, in the late 1940s. There were 4 editions. This narrative gets included in the second edition. Jerry Bentley, a historian, suggests looking at history from a seascape perspective by exploring the impact of global maritime mercantile networks sustained by nodes of port cities. Bentley also proposes looking at the migration and forced movement of people, the spread of new technologies, especially printing. He emphasizes the faster and further circulation of human and things across vast geographical divides. I use this framework and look at the period under study as more integrated and connected world where peoples, cultures, and regions become increasingly linked through global networks and circulations and exchanges. I argue that in addition to the availability of printing technology, creation of railroads and steam engines, which opened up far-flung oceanic routes, had a major impact on the printing and distribution of texts. Migration and the resulting increased demand for the literature have affected the process of publication and circulation of religious texts across national and transnational community networks, especially those across the Western Indian Ocean regions. While reconstructing the history of text production and prosopography of forgotten actors, I identified over 70 texts that were printed in the second half of the 19th century. I repeat, 70 texts printed in the second half of the 19th century, of which only 5 or 6 have been cited by the scholars. The finding thus challenges the current understanding that there was no significant printing activity before the early 20th century. I came across seven individuals involved in printing Ginān and other religious literature from as early as the 1860s and identified almost 50 publications by a single individual named, and hopefully this should work, Alauddin Ghulam Hussain. By the way, I'm using the transliteration from the Gujarati. So the way the name appears in Gujarati and Khoji text, that's how I've transliterated there. I acknowledge Dr. Karim Tharani, who shared a circular dated 1888 by Alauddin that lists 44 publications by him. You can see the circular on the screen in Khojki, i.e. the script used by the Khojas, quote-unquote Khojas. The other myth that this circular helps to break is that Gujarati printing of religious texts did not start till the second decade of the 20th century, which is current belief, as this circular lists 9 publications in Gujarati. A careful study of the literature produced by Alauddin can help one develop a comprehensive list of publications which can aid in the study of history and theology of the time. This image from his publication has a Zahirnama. By the way, there is those who can read Khojki, it says Tamam Shud, interestingly a Farsi phrase to end the text. A careful study of the literature produced by Alauddin can help us develop a comprehensive list. And this is the example where his Zahirnama, meaning an announcement or the publisher's note, where he announces that after the publication of this work, in this case, Kalam-e-Maula, he will publish Miraznama, Noornama, and an Arabic text. I'm yet to come across that. Here, I must acknowledge that the literature catalogued by Professor Asani and housed at Harvard University and digitally accessible for the researchers was extremely useful in developing this paper. So far, I have managed to access 16 lithographs and printed books by Alauddin. You will notice that one of his works listed here was published in 1907, and I've colored this in red and we'll come to it in a few minutes. Just to show how elaborate these publications were, I have provided the image of a publication that you see on the screen. The publication is over 650 pages large and titled The Book of 12 Granths, that is long Gināns, and 103 Gināns. Actually, the book contains 101, but this is the largest compilation of Ginān texts, single compilation of Ginān texts that I have come across, and that is by Alauddin Ghulam Hussain, the man who is not almost forgotten by the historians. Existence of over 70 publications by Alauddin and many others prove that there was a major printing activity in the 19th century, which is not known or hardly been studied or utilized by the researchers studying Ginān literature or the history of the Satpanth Ismailis. To illustrate the point, I have 3 publications from the second half of the 19th century on the screen, and I would like to talk about them. To the extreme left is the 1865 publication called Ibrat Afza. By the way, in Gujarati it says Ibrat Afza. This is a Gujarati translation of the Persian biography of the first Aga Khan. Both Daryoush and Daniel, I understand, are in the room. Well, Daryoush has disappeared. Oh, well, he's there. Daryoush and Daniel are in the audience, who have recently published an English translation of the work using the original Farsi Persian text. However, I noticed that the translator of the Gujarati work provides some additional information that is not found in the original. I'm using this example to make a point that such 19th century publications can add to our understanding of the history of the period. In the middle, we see book titled Imamat, which was published in March 1896 by Kalamkash, obviously a pen name, which was published Kalamkash explains how the Ismaili Imams are the direct descendant of Ali bin Abu Talib, and elaborates on the concept of Imamat, making it an important theological discourse of the 19th century. And finally, the one on the right is an interesting work from 1866, and the publication is titled, for those who read Gujarati, Marhum Aga Ali Shani Lashne Karbala Pohchadwano Khas Mukhi Kasam Ali Musa Tarafthi Malelo Ahwal. Now, interestingly, this says that the dead body or the casket Sanduk was taken from Bombay via Bandar Abbas to Karbala. But when you read the account, it clarifies that the casket was taken to Najaf and not Karbala. So the book title says Karbala, but the account talks about Najaf. And in that context, I have brought the image, which I was told by Dr. Daftary that he has been looking for 40 years. This is from January this year. And this is, for those who can read the Farsi Arabic text there, talks about Maqbara of Aka Alisha, Aga Alisha Aga Khan al-Hussaini in Najaf. And I'm skipping some text. Coming back to the topic of discussion, the belief that early 20th century Lalji Devraj, century printer Lalji Devraj was the major figure, forced scholars to try and justify their claim, leading to some myths. This gave birth to another myth. Many scholars claim that Devraj used Khoja moving typefaces, specially manufactured in Germany for the quote-unquote first time. My research using printed text as an object of research has proved this to be wrong. Juan Bruce, in his recent work on typographic development of the Khoja script, has come to the same conclusion as I have. The image that you see on the screen is of a text now. No Chuga, that's what written here, by Pir Hassan Kabiruddin, and published by Alauddin Ghulam Hussain in 1886. If we turn the page over, we can clearly see the punch and the relief of the metal types. Such marks are clear indication of a paper book being printed using relief process or typefaces, as opposed to lithography. Here is another example, and I have not highlighted the text, but I hope you can. It's visible, the impressions are visible, embossing effect is visible. This proves that Alauddin had access to Khoja typefaces, and the assumption that Lalji Devraj was the first person to travel to Hamburg in Germany to get the Khoja typefaces manufactured seems to be wrong. This also nullifies the argument that Alauddin got out of the printing business, as he was publishing only lithographs and not printed books using typefaces. That's another myth that's propagated. And I'm not suggesting any malicious intention here. It's the way history unfolds. More evidences give better understanding of history. This was just one illustration highlighting how Alauddin's contribution gets undermined by a skewed reading of the 20th century publications. Let me provide some biographical details of our newly found unsung hero, Alauddin Ghulam Hussain. He established Ghulam Hussain Chapkhanu Press and started publishing Ginān and prayer books in 1864. Before establishing his own press, he was working with the Oriental Printing Press in Mumbai. Interestingly, the first edition of Ibrat Afza was printed by Oriental Printing Press, so I'm sure his connections were useful. Available primary sources tell us that the press was exclusively created for printing Ismaili religious materials. Analysis of the 16 publications that I had access to suggests that the lithograph process was employed during the initial 20 to 30 years, making printing large quantities quickly a bit difficult when you use lithography. I have not come across any non-Ismaili text bearing his name. My initial attempt to develop a prosopography of this individual reveals that he was an important figure in the community during the first decade of the 20th century. Let us look at some crucial episodes from his life to highlight his contribution. Aladdin played a crucial role as a witness in favor of the Aga Khan III, in a famous court case known as Haji Bibi case, which was on the floor between 1905 and July 1908 in the Mumbai High Court. To prove the community's Ismaili identity, some published religious literature was presented to the court. Aladdin was called to the court as a witness in July 1908, where he accepted that he had published these lithographs in his handwriting. According to Aladdin, he printed 500 to 1,000 copies of dua, everyday prayer that Ismailis use, copies of dua books every year to be distributed to Ismaili places of worship, Jamaat Khana, for free. Aladdin's testimony about his printing activities and his articulation of his religious identity helped the Aga Khan's claim that the Aga Khan and his ancestors were Ismailis or Ismaili Imams, and Satpanthis had always been Ismailis. After examining records, testimonies, religious literature, and many other rituals, Justice Russell recognized the Khojas as Shia Ismailis. He ruled that their Imam, Aga Khan III, has absolute authority over the community and exclusive right to its offerings. I have elaborated Aladdin's role in the Haji Bibi case to prove that Aladdin was an important actor during the first decade of the 20th century, who seems to have been forgotten by the historians studying the period. During the court hearing, in reply to a question, he informed the court that his press was closed in July 1906. Based on this, Shackle and Moir, Zawahir Moir, claimed that Aladdin was replaced by Lalji Devraj. And I'm quoting them here. Aladdin was replaced by Lalji Devraj. Before I proceed, I would like to bring back that slide where I had highlighted one text in red. And though Aladdin says that he had closed down the press in July 1906, this publication by Aladdin is now not from Mumbai, but is from Bandra, Bazar Road, Bandra, and is dated 1907. And that kind of leaves many questions to be answered by the historians. Based on his statement in the court about the process he followed in copying the manuscript, we can conclude that Ghulam-e-Hussain publications are significant for the study of Gināns for the simple reason that Aladdin did not seem to have edited, which was common practice in the 20th century. Aladdin did not edit his works before publishing, but copied exactly as the text was written in the manuscript, reproducing even the errors. And he acknowledges this in his colophons. Many of these manuscripts may not be available for researchers today. And thus, it becomes very important, based on his claim, Aladdin's publication can be treated as printed manuscripts. Before we end, let us look at how migration and transport created the demand and enabled the circulation of texts. The Ismaili community started migrating from Gujarat, Punjab, and Sindh, their original home, to various parts of the Indian Ocean regions in the early 19th century, and later to East and South India from the late 1840s. Initially, such migration was driven by the fact that their Imam, the first Aga Khan, had arrived from Persia and settled in Kolkata for a couple of years before making Bombay his home. The introduction of the new means of travel, the railroad, coincided with the settlement of the first Aga Khan in India and aided traveling and migration. Ian Kerr's assertion crediting the introduction of railways in India to the creation of modern India is equally important for the history of the Ginān text circulation. She attributes the socio-economic transformation of the nation to the increased mobility due to railroads. Satpanth Ismailis benefited from this development as much as any other religious community. So basically, I'm going to skip for the sake of time. I'm the last presenter, so I don't have a choice of going on and on. So quickly, I had access to a 1927 printed book, which had the names of the patrons, and I've analyzed those names. The names from Gujarat, Angul in the east, Bangalore and Hyderabad in the south, and Agra and various other places in, as long as Dehradun in the north are mentioned there. 3/4 of the patronage came from these people who had migrated to various parts of India. And that tells us that it was the demand by these migrants from those regions. And by the way, the list of patrons runs into 10 pages, and that tells you how extensive the patronage was, and that led to the number of books being printed in the 19th century, and this element of environmental factors. Just to use Nile Green, Nile Green is not talking about Gināns, but he says that large number of books were printed in Bombay, which were distributed far and wide through the oceanic networks of the Great Port. Now, if the books were printed in Bombay, it was an important center of the printing, and were getting circulated, then we have a reason to believe that Ginān printing went through the same historical process. And that's the point that I was trying to make. Thank you very much.
We are 5 minutes over time, so we will thank our speakers, but I will urge you to kind of catch them during lunch and ask more questions. Thank you.